Welcome, everybody, to our open public education program. This is the first part of our six-part series called The Development of Addiction. I would like to start with an apology, and I would like to apologize for the lies of past drug educators, including myself. I have been talking about drugs in front of audiences for the last 28 years, and I would like to acknowledge that people like me who talk about drugs publicly have told three lies. We've exaggerated the harms of drugs, we've never acknowledged the benefits of drugs, and we never talk about the harms of drug prohibition. I will break those three lies, and I will talk honestly about the harms of drugs, honestly about the benefits of drugs, and we will talk openly in our last session about the harms that our dominant policies do to us in terms of fundamentally how we see drugs in our society. So let's start by asking a very basic question. What is a drug? A drug is any substance other than food that changes the way the mind or the body functions. Drugs may or may not have medicinal properties or purposes. Drugs can come from plants or be made in labs. An example of a drug that is grown as a plant and used as a plant is cannabis. An example of a drug that is grown as a plant and changed into a white powder is cocaine. An example of a drug that has no association with plants is crystal meths. Drugs can be legal, illegal, helpful, or harmful depending on the context of use. And we will elaborate on that statement in just a little while. In fact, what I will observe is there's a complete disconnect in our society between the drugs that are illegal and the drugs that are helpful and drugs that are harmful. We just don't seem to have that right in our society. I will talk more about that in a while. While we of the addiction services open our doors to anybody to come in and talk to us about substances that they can't stop, smoking, injecting, eating, snorting, etc., really there's only a handful of drugs that people come to us and ask for help with. For example, caffeine. Caffeine is a drug. It's a liquid stimulant drug, and it's widely available in our society. Nicotine is a drug. Ritalin is a drug. Cocaine is a drug, alcohol is a drug, cannabis is a drug, LSD, Xanax, Valium, and heroin are all drugs. But really, the ones that people actually ask us for help for are quite limited. And it comes down to alcohol, heroin, cocaine, cannabis, yes. Some people can't stop smoking the stuff and they come to us for help. Crystal meth, and there's a few prescription drugs that people have troubles with. The opiate-based prescription drugs, things like OxyContin, and the other classification of drugs that people have a real struggle with are called benzodiazepines. They're Valium, Ativan, Ciroc, clorazepam, lorazepam. That whole classification of drugs is a significant problem in many people's lives. While in that list, I've included alcohol. Alcohol is a drug. Alcohol is a liquid sedative drug, and if it was invented today, it would only be available on prescription. And yet we in our society see it as being a non-drug. The truth of the matter is, it's a very strong drug. I don't believe in the concept of hard drugs and soft drugs, but if I did, alcohol would be a hard drug. It's a fairly obnoxious drug. One of the things that I do is I'm involved with training the Vancouver Police Department, and I always ask them the question, from a policing perspective, what is the most obnoxious drug in our society? And 100% of the time, they always say alcohol. If somebody's going to take a swing at a cop, they're probably drunk. There are completely beneficial uses of substances. For example, to get better if we're ill, doctor's prescription, to reduce pain or illness or injury, to prevent illness, things like inoculation, and to manage mental illness by balancing brain chemistry. Those are completely useful approaches to drugs. Helping us to do things we can't do on our own, things like insulin, very helpful for us if we're diabetic. Moderate use in social or ritualistic settings are a beneficial relationship with substances. An appropriate use is profoundly influenced by factors such as religion and culture. I have a counselor that I worked with for many years who was Iranian. And she was raised as a middle-class woman in Iran, and her nanny smoked opium. And the way that the family dealt with her smoking of opium was actually similar to how we in our society deal with picking your nose. It's something you do in private, not in public. So here was a woman whose Nannies smoked opium, and they didn't approve, but at no point would they ever have considered phoning the police. And so in Iran, the drug that we see as being the big bad drug, because it's kind of similar to our drug heroin, is really something that's quietly socially disapproved of, and they'd never consider criminalizing it. So the context, the cultural context of drugs is huge and absolutely fascinating to me. And I think that we can learn a lot from other cultures and other groups around the planet, looking at how they have positive or destructive relationships with drugs. There are ways of misusing drugs. For example, taking too much at one time, or taking smaller dosages too often, or taking a drug for too long a period of time, extending the prescription well beyond the point at which it's useful, or the wrong use of a drug. For example, senior citizens' homes, where two people will trade 2 reds for a blue, that's always a problem. So taking the right drug for the right situation is useful. When it's outside of that, quickly we develop problems. Combinations of drugs can be problematic for people. If you think about drugs through the lens of the coroner in Vancouver, the person who has to deal with drug overdose deaths, often what they see is combinations of sedative drugs. Specifically, people will drink a whole lot of alcohol and make really bad decisions about other sedative drugs, and often that kills people. I have been in this business for 28 years. And I have never in my 28 years ever labeled anybody as an addict or an alcoholic. And the reason why is because I don't want to have an argument with somebody. If somebody walks in my office and I say, you're an addict or an alcoholic, they're going to argue against it because they probably have an image of an alcoholic or an addict that's different from themselves. And then I'll have this debate about what it means to be an alcoholic or an addict. Now, many people bring me that label. And when they do, I work within the context of that label, absolutely. But I never offer that label to anybody. I just talk about harms and benefits. What is the drug doing to you that is harmful? What is the drug doing to you that's beneficial? And because I'm quite willing to say controversial things, any drug can be misused and any drug can be used. In fact, that statement started with Paracelsus, who's arguably the father of modern medicine. And in the 1500s, he said, all substances are poisons. There is none which is not a poison, and it's the right dose that differentiates poison from remedy. Another way of putting that is any drug has the potential for harm or benefit, depending on who's using it, what context, and what purpose. So when I'm working with large groups, often I'll do an exercise. And the exercise is I have people name a drug, and then I identify all the possible harms and all the possible benefits. And the truth of the matter is there's no drug that you can't name that I can't go through that exercise with. Any drug can be used and any drug can be abused. In fact, I know water isn't a drug, but water can be abused. Some people drink so much of it, it does them harm. We can have an abusive relationship with water. So there is no such thing as a good drug, and there's no such thing as a bad drug. They're just chemicals. And our relationship with them can go profoundly wrong or help us to live happier, stronger, healthier lives. One of the more interesting drugs that I find fascinating to look at in terms of harms and benefits is tobacco. Now, tobacco actually isn't a drug. Tobacco is a delivery system of a drug. The drug itself is nicotine, and the delivery is tobacco. It's also interesting to look at tobacco because it isn't the nicotine that kills you. If you smoke so much of it, it's actually the tobacco that kills you. You can take nicotine in other forms, and it doesn't do you as much harm. But if I was thinking that through, and I was saying, what is a beneficial and harmful relationship with tobacco, I would give you a clue by showing you this slide. When white folks first showed up at the shores of North America, they were greeted by our Aboriginal brothers and sisters and allowed us to live. We would have died a miserable death if they hadn't greeted us and welcomed us. But what we experienced was those folks smoked tobacco, and they smoked it in ritualistic contexts. In fact, nobody ever died. We sort of talked about it being the peace pipe, but it was a lot more complicated than that. It was actually a ritualistic sharing of tobacco in communities where the truth was spoken, and it would help them to resolve conflicts. There was no cancer, no overdose deaths, no emphysema, there was no harm done in that ritualistic use of tobacco. And then we took it, we purified it, we changed it, and we made it so it doesn't go out when you don't constantly puff on it. And we added stuff to it to make it more addictive, and now it kills us massively. Same drug, though, two completely different contexts, and one is beneficial and one is harmful. Another exercise I do with groups is I ask the question, why do we as a human species initially use drugs? Now, not why do we use them when we're dependent on them, but why do we initially use them? And I usually come up with a whole list of various reasons why we do drugs. And they usually include things like forget problems, escape, get high, lose, gain weight, relax, energize, go to sleep, stay awake, boredom, depression, gain confidence, be cool, socialize, have friends, experience altered states, excitement, to prove how bad we are. That's an interesting one. One of the needs, one of the basic human needs that every human being has on the planet is to brush the teeth of a somebody. Nobody can be a nobody. And drugs allow us to be a somebody. And if we are a teenager who's just been kicked out of high school for smoking a joint, and we show up at a new high school and need to reconnect with a new group of friends, we need to do that by being a somebody, and the best way to do that is to wave a joint around. Because the moment we do that, we become a somebody. It's funny, when you talk to a group of people long enough about drugs, sooner or later you start talking about sex. It's just the way it works. So some people take drugs to express a part of their sexuality they are not comfortable with. And when I learned that, working in the addictions field, I now can ask the right question at the right time. And specifically, cocaine and stimulant drugs are often used in that way. Sports, religious rituals, reduce pain, physical and emotional, have fun, excitement, gain confidence, reduce anxiety, and to experiment. So those are the reasons why we, as a human species, often use drugs initially. It's an interesting list, because you can go back over that list and ask the question, is this a list of our basic human needs? Does this list apply to all of us? And it does. This is a list of this is a description of humanity. So we get pulled into the drug-using experience initially because of who we are as a species. We can have 4 different relationships with drugs. We can become dependent on them. And by that I mean, we get really, really sick when we stop using them. We can have a problematic relationship with drugs, which means we don't get really, really sick when we stop, but it's causing havoc in our lives. It's causing problems with our relationships, our finances, our family life, our work life. It's just creating problems for us. We can have a neutral relationship that's not problematic, but also not beneficial. A non-problematic relationship, no good, no harm. Or we can have a beneficial relationship with drugs. By that I mean we are happier, we are healthier, we live longer, we are better parents, better students, better employees. Now, people like me have historically had a pretty rigid line down the middle of this graph, and we always talked about the stuff on the right, and we never talked about the stuff on the left. So I am offering you something different here. I am offering what I called honest drug education. If I'm going to talk about the lies of past drug educators, I have to do something different. And I will talk about drugs from a place of frank honesty. So I will acknowledge that there are 4 different relationships that we can have, not just 2. Now, admittedly, most of the time I talk about the stuff on the right, but I need to acknowledge that the stuff on the left exists. And the examples on the left, the far left, are medical psychopharmaceuticals, coffee to increase alertness, moderate consumption of red wine, and sacramental use of ayahuasca and peyote, which have been used for centuries by Aboriginal people in different parts of North and South America. I would like to define addiction, and I'm going to define addiction in 3 different ways. I'm going to define it according to the big book, which is the DSM-4. I'm going to define it according to my employer, and I'm going to give you my definition just to throw out some new thoughts here. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is an absolutely huge book that lists every possible mental illness. And in there is substance dependence. And it's very precise how it defines it. In order to be defined as substance dependent, you need to have any three of these in the last 12 months. And the first one is tolerance. What does that mean? It means it takes more to get the same effect. When we start taking drugs, we use small amounts, and slowly we escalate our use. It goes up and up and up as our body stops responding. And when we do this talk next time, what I'll talk about is why that happens. I'll talk a lot about brain chemistry and why we actually stop responding to drugs. But then what happens as our body stops responding, we take more. And our body stops responding, and we take more. And our body stops responding, and we take more as we develop this process of tolerance. And then we stop taking them, and we go into withdrawal, and we get really, really sick. So the analogy that I have to describe withdrawal is if you're walking down the same street to go to work or school or play, and you're always doing the same walk, and you see a large red awning that appears on your sidewalk, you're going to react the first time. You'll have a big response. Oh my God, you'll either love it or you'll hate it, but you'll notice it. If you keep walking down the same street, you're going to stop noticing the awning. You will get used to it in your environment. It'll become background to your environment. And you won't notice it again until they take it away. And then suddenly you'll respond again. So that's a bit like tolerance and withdrawal. If we get used to certain things in our environment, and then when they are removed, we respond. The third one is the amount duration, when the substance is used in larger amounts over longer periods in time than was intended. For example, I tell my wife, I'm going to go to the bar and have 2 beers. I'll be home by 9 o'clock at night. At 1 in the morning, I'm sitting in the bar. I've had 12 beers, and I'm no longer married. I have a problem. How much I was going to consume and the length of time that I was going to consume it completely changed the moments my lips touched alcohol. The ability, the desire to persistently control substance use. It's a bit like, who's a modern day boxer? I keep wanting to say Muhammad Ali. He's not a modern day boxer. Who's a modern day boxer? Does anybody know?
Mayweather.
Mayweather? Mayweather. So let's just imagine for a second that I climbed in the ring with Mayweather. Now, I can tell you what's going to happen. It's completely predictable. If I climbed in the ring with a professional boxer, I would be very quickly clobbered and thrown out of the ring. If I somehow was conscious and I was able to climb back into the ring with Mayweather, I would be clobbered again and thrown out of the ring. If I was still able to climb back in the ring with Mayweather, I would be clobbered again and thrown out of the ring again. And if somehow I had a belief that I was able to control what happened in that environment with Mayweather, I would be completely and 100% wrong. I can never control what happens in that ring. And the trick to my life, if I want to not get clobbered by Mayweather, is to stay out of the ring, because I cannot control it. And if I believe that I can control this circumstance that is fundamentally out of control for me, I have one of the things it takes to be considered as substance dependent. Time. Before I become substance dependent, I do all kinds of other things with my time, and activities as well, and commitments. I do a variety of things. Perhaps I like lifting weights or jumping out of planes or playing chess or just hanging out with my friends in the park and throwing the frisbee. I do a lot of different things. I hang out with family, I hang out with friends, I hang out with community. I do have a different interest that I chase. And slowly those become eroded, and I do less and less and less of that stuff as my drug use becomes more and more time-consuming and an activity I choose more. And eventually, I'm given a choice. I can jump in the swimming pool and do a couple of laps, or I can smoke a joint. And I can't smoke a joint in the swimming pool because it goes out every single time. And I choose the joint. That's the choice of an addiction. And the last one is repetitive use despite negative consequences. And the negative consequences can build, so they've actually become pretty significant in my life, and I continue to use it. Now, in my field, we talk about this word called denial. And I don't think it's really about denying that the negative consequences are there. It's more about rationalizing, finding some way to understand it and justifying it to others, and then it just continues. So that's the formal definition of substance dependence. My employer's definition is a little different. They say it's a biopsychosocial, spiritual, environmental phenomenon. It's got something to do with the body, and it does. The brain changes, and we'll talk about that next time. There's also a psychological process. It's called compulsion, where I simply have to use all the time, and I think about it all the time. It also changes who I hang out with, quite profoundly. It also is something to do with my spiritualness. My ability to be spiritual changes, and by that I mean having a sense of meaning and purpose to life. Life is important for this reason. There is something to do with addiction. That spirituality gets fried in that process. And it's also got something to do with my environment. If I am living in a hotel room with a half an inch of cigarette butts on the floor, that is an addictive environment. So that is my employer's definition of addiction. It's a biopsychosocial, spiritual, and environmental phenomenon. And because I like to be controversial and to get people thinking a different way, I'd like to offer you my definition in addition to those two definitions. Addiction is an attachment disorder. Addiction is any substance abuse is any drug use that breaks healthy connections with family, friends, and society. What I observe in my work is a lot of people talk to me about substance dependence. And what I observe is many people come into my office, and one of the questions I ask is, who would you suggest I phone if you collapsed in a medical emergency? For some of the folks that come into my office, there's nobody to phone. There's absolutely nobody. There's no friends, there's no family, there's no community. There's no individual out there who would care if somebody was convulsing on the floor of my office. So that tells me a lot about the path that they have walked in terms of their addictions. Because addiction, at the end of the day, is an attachment disorder. And it happens in two separate ways. One is, as I walk the path of addiction, I become disconnected as I become more and more focused on the substances. But also, if I wasn't taught as a child to attach, if I didn't have loving people around me, I become enormously vulnerable to addictions because I feel the pain of that emptiness with drugs. So it kind of goes both ways. Both the chicken and the egg is a cycle. And attachment disorders and addictions go hand in hand. And we'll talk about that more as this series of talks unfolds. If I had a buck for every time somebody walked into my office and said, why me? Why am I in the place of addiction? Why can't I stop thinking about this substance in my life? I would have a stack of bucks on the table about this big. So the answer to that question, the question, why me, is not a simple one, because there is no one answer. In fact, if I want to answer that question for somebody, what I do is I walk them through the series of risk factors that I'm about to walk you through. And of this list, what I suggest is people delete what is irrelevant to them, expand what's really big for them, and make small but keep the ones that are there but really not high on the list. And if I've gone through that exercise with somebody, the answer will be clear as to why me. So what are the risk factors for addiction? Well, genetic is on the list. Now, the study of genetics and its relationship to addictions indicates that it is a small risk factor. It's not huge. It's on the list, but it's not big. So what it actually says, the research has been done with alcohol, what it says is that I am more at risk to have an out-of-control relationship with alcohol if my father was an alcoholic than if my mother was an alcoholic. I am more at risk to have a problem with alcohol if my grandfather was an alcoholic than if my grandmother was alcoholic. So it seems to be passed through the male gene, and it's relatively weak. It's not a huge driver, but it's useful to be aware if we have it. And one of the clues is the first time I drink, how much can I drink? How tolerant am I to alcohol? If I have a much higher tolerance than the other people in the group who are also drinking for the first time, that's a clue I might have the genetic risk factor. There are biological factors. For example, womb exposure. If I was inside my mother and she drank a huge amount of alcohol, I will have problems. And one of the problems that it could lead me to is an increased risk for addictions. Now, drug effects is on the list. In fact, we will talk about this for a whole discussion that we'll have. We'll actually talk about the individual drugs we can have problems with. But you know, it's not first on the list. And it's not first on the list for a reason. Is that if you have drug effects by themselves, you don't tend to have addictions. For example, soldiers that come back from battle are often physically addicted to opiate drugs. In spite of those wonderful recruitment posters telling you how wonderful it is to join the army, the truth of the matter is it's usually a traumatizing experience. And people, when they're in battle, take a lot of drugs to reduce their fear and their pain. And so they come back to the shores of Canada, and they often have physical dependencies, and often physical dependencies to drugs like heroin. And they don't continue their addictions once they hit the shore of Vancouver and Canada. So in spite of the fact that we can have a physical dependency to a drug, it doesn't actually translate into an addiction when the circumstances change. It's interesting to go to university and to sign up for a course called personality. Can you imagine doing that? So if you do that, what you learn is personality is actually a whole lot of bars on a graph. And there's many of them, many aspects to personality. For example, introversion and extroversion. Are you outgoing or are you shy? Now, most of the bars on the graph of personality have nothing to do with addiction. It doesn't matter whether you're outgoing or shy. It has nothing to do with addiction. But there are a couple of bars on the graph that do make a difference. For example, high vulnerability to anxiety or depression. People who are really anxious tend to be attracted to depressant drugs. People who have a real struggle with depression tend to be attracted to stimulant drugs. Also, impulsivity, the urgent need to have fun and to make decisions without really considering it. Now, one can say that impulsivity is the same as risk-taking behavior. Somebody gave me this photograph, and I thought that would be perfect for this part of the presentation. That cat has courage. There are also health issues and mental health issues that are related to addiction. If I have chronic pain in my life, then I will certainly be attracted to the drugs that reduce pain. And certainly there are a lot of mental illnesses that people medicate with drugs that are available on the street. Did you know that sex was actually different from gender? Sex is your body. It's the physical structure of your anatomy. Gender is the role that you play in society. And for some folks, those are the same, and for some folks, those are different. There are sex vulnerabilities for addiction, and there are gender vulnerabilities for addiction. Did you know that female bodies are different from male bodies? One of the differences between female bodies and male bodies is the water-fat ratio. Essentially, the human body is a bag of skin. And inside of our bag of skin is various chemicals, including water and fat. A 100-pound woman standing here will have more fat in her body and less water than a 100-pound man who's standing here. So women have more fat and less water, but the average woman is also smaller than the average man. If you take 1,000 women and you put them on one end of the teeter-totter, and 1,000 random men and you put them on the other end of the teeter-totter, the men will weigh more than the women. So men have more water in their bodies than women. So women are more vulnerable to the effects of water-soluble drugs. And a woman will also become more intoxicated on a water-soluble drug than a man. And she will experience more damage because it's more concentrated in her system. Another risk factor is early drug use. I talked to some folks and they actually started their drug use before they were 10 years old. They were pinching pills and huffing gasoline and doing all kinds of things. And certainly the folks that I talked to that started intravenous drug use in their early teens have a huge risk factor. The earlier we start using drugs, the more problems we have with them. We have a program that goes into schools to talk to high schools to talk to kids about drugs. And the mandate of that program is to prevent or delay drug use. And the reason why we want to delay it is because those early years of teenagers, the early teen years, are hugely risky for us to be experimenting with drugs with. And if we can delay it a few years, we tend to have much fewer problems with drugs. Attachment to healthy adults and mainstream culture is another risk factor. If I want to assess in this example, I'll say a 16-year-old girl who shows up in my office, and I want to get a sense of her healthiness. One of the questions that I can ask her is, who do you like, who do you trust, would you go to if you had a problem, who would you like to be like, who do you like hanging out with? And if she only gives me other teenage girls in that list, she's essentially told me she has a really big problem. If she has some connection with adults who care for her that she feels connected to, if she has Aunt May in her life and she bakes bread with Aunt May once every 2 Saturdays, and when she's baking bread with Aunt May, she can talk about absolutely anything. What she's telling me is she's a healthier young girl than the other young girl who has no adults in her life that she feels connected to. Family of origin is a risk factor. Now, often what that actually means is abuse. It's sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. Now, I have been doing this work for many years, and I have asked more people than I can count the very simple question: what was life like for you growing up as a kid? And from that simple question, what I get is one of two experiences. Either people proceed to tell me a horror story, or there was no problems at all. So for the people that I see, quite a few of them have had significant abuses and traumas in their past. But the other folks actually haven't, and it's all the other things on this list that contribute. There are also cultural risk factors. And by that I mean our culture has significant attitudes that I think are really problematic for us. And I'm going to elaborate on that as we go along. But certainly how our culture sees drugs, fundamentally our attitudes that we have are risk factors for all of us. There are also external stressors, things like poverty, job stress, single parenting, unemployment, divorce. When we experience these kind of things, often we want to medicate our way through those and reduce the emotional pain that they cause. And then there's trauma. The trauma history of the people that come to talk to us is significant. Natural disasters, civil wars, international conflicts, rape, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on. I have had the odd experience of actually being in a refugee camp in Mozambique. Actually, it was across the street from Mozambique. The road was down the middle. On my right was Malawi, on the left was Mozambique, and all the war refugees were coming over to the refugee camp in Malawi. And I stopped as I was driving along and went in and talked to people. And I completely understand that anybody that comes from those kind of experience will be traumatized. That is a traumatic environment. And for people who come from these environments into the Canadian culture will have a trauma history that then we need to step up to the plate and start to talk about and help them to heal. Another risk factor is what's available. I have never talked to anybody with an addiction to khat, K-H-A-T, because it's used in Africa all the time, but it doesn't travel very well. It's a leaf that has a mild stimulant property that can have significant problems for some people. But it doesn't exist in Canada because if you package it through the mail, there won't be much left by the time you get there. It all goes into the air. It's volatile. So what's around is what people tend to have problems with. Peer group. Who am I hanging out with? Who do I socialize with? Who do I hang with? Who do I play with? The people in my life are huge in terms of their influence of me. Every once in a while, in my office, somebody has what I call a eureka. And a eureka is a huge moment of understanding about what's driving their addiction. Why are they having this conversation with me? Why are they struggling to deal with their addictions? And I've made a list of the things that people have understood as they talk to me about their past. So the difficult understanding is I'm in the place of addiction and it's forming a function for me. It actually does something for me and I'm chasing that something, and that's why I'm in the place of addiction. Now, usually, when somebody has this understanding that I'm about to talk to you about, it's associated with a lot of Kleenex. We buy Kleenex in our office by the bulk because of these kind of conversations. So the kind of things that addiction can do for me is it provides a role for me. It provides an identity, and I should put the word friends in quotation marks, but it provides for some of us people that I can hang out with during the day. Perhaps the past is so obnoxious I don't want to think about it. And one way of avoiding the past is to create chaos in my life today. Perhaps it's about a way of avoiding my responsibilities. Perhaps I'm a businessman. Perhaps I'm running this business and I can't go to my colleagues and say, I can't run a business anymore. But I can go to my colleagues and I can say, I developed an addiction. Perhaps it's an excuse to fail. Perhaps it's my way of explaining to my community that I could not do what I set myself up to do. Perhaps I'm in a relationship and I really don't want to be in the relationship anymore. And so it's my way of withdrawing from intimacy. It's my way of kind of being there physically, but not being there in any other way. Perhaps it's my way of ending a relationship. Perhaps I can't say I just don't want to be with you anymore. So perhaps it's my way of exiting because I know that she will throw me out if I behave obnoxiously enough for a long enough period of time. Perhaps it's revenge. Perhaps I just want to get my parents back. Perhaps it's providing normal chaos for me. Perhaps my environment that I grew up in was chaotic. It was a crazy environment that people were yelling at each other all the time. That's normal for me. And if I want to create normal, one of the best ways of doing that is create an addiction, because I will create chaos around me when I'm addicted. Perhaps I hate myself. And my acting out of my self-hate is how I'm doing that with the addiction. What I have said so far is, addiction is not simple. Addiction is a complex process that has a whole lot to do with our humanity. And it really isn't fundamentally about drugs. It's about all kinds of human experiences that we all have. And one of the clues that that's the right way of thinking about it is that when I do addiction, I can do addiction to all kinds of things. It's not just about drugs. I can become addicted to television, internet, or video games, food, work, gambling, exercise, dieting, shopping, dangerous sports, and even my sexual behavior can be completely addictive. In fact, if you think about all of the definitions of addiction that I just explored a few moments ago, for some of us, for some of our sexual behavior, you can go through exactly the same checklist and come up with the same process that it is actually doing us harm. So the next part of this presentation is called Patterns of Substance Use. Now, I'd like to reflect on the history. I've been doing this presentation for so many years. We used to call it the development of addiction. And we used to sort of say that people walk these steps towards addiction as it gets worse and worse and worse. And the truth of the matter is, it's not that simple, because there isn't just one path that people walk towards this end goal of addiction. It doesn't work that way. There's really different kinds of relationships that we can have with substances and different ways that we take them to get different risks and different benefits. So I'm going to go through a series of different patterns, different types of relationships that we can have with substances. And in fact, I'm going to start by talking about Ernie. Now, Ernie started with Q-tips, and then slowly he moved on to the hard stuff. And by the time Ernie was finished, Ernie wasn't using Q-tips anymore. He was using broomsticks. And he actually had a pretty big problem. When he walked into my office, Ernie was in very big trouble. So let's talk about the development, or let's talk about patterns of substance use. One of the patterns that we can have with substances is to not use them. So non-using is an option for us as people. And it's also interesting to look at why some of us, in fact, it's not the majority of us, it is some of us, we don't use. And by that I mean we do not use alcohol, we do not use cigarettes, we do not use illegal drugs, but we hopefully do take the things our doctor tells us to take. So this doesn't include prescription drugs, but it includes illegal alcohol and tobacco. So some of us choose not to use because it's just a personal choice for health reasons. You know, we've decided that it's not good for our health and we don't want to do it. Perhaps there are social reasons, perhaps there are family reasons. Perhaps I want to be part of a group, and the group says if you want to participate with me and us in this group, you need to not use. That's how we identify as a group. Perhaps I've had a really long-term addiction to drugs, and I've just decided I can't stand it anymore and I don't want to use anymore. Perhaps I've had a brief experience that didn't work for me, and I've decided it's not going to work for me. So one option for us around our relationship with substances is to not use them. Another relationship that we can have with them is to experiment with them. And this is the only type of relationship that we can't stay in, because I'm defining it as the first couple of times we use. In order to experiment with drugs, we have to have a willingness to try, friends or acquaintances that use, and a sense of safety about the drug setting. And all of the reasons we talked about before, things from boredom to curiosity to peer pressure, a need to belong, depression, many other things that pull us into the desire to experiment with drugs. Now, even in the experimental stage, there are some risks. For example, they tend to be risks of naivety. If you look at people who die from alcohol overdose, they tend to not be experienced drinkers. They tend to be younger folks who are beginning their relationship with alcohol. So alcohol overdose deaths tends to be about naivety. They really don't know what it's going to do if they drink that much. There's also the naivety of not knowing dealers, not knowing where to get them, and the kind of whole problem that people can go through when they are just experimenting because they really don't understand what the drug is going to do, where to get it, and how to manage that process. We can also have a social relationship with substances. And by that I mean we are taking a drug, but the reason why we're taking the drug, and in this circumstance, is not primarily the drug itself. The classic example being the toast for the bride at the wedding. Now, if the liquor stores were on strike and there was no alcohol available, the wedding would probably still continue, and people would show up. The reason why people show up to a wedding is not to drink alcohol. They show up to celebrate the union of these two people. So that is a classic example of social use. Yes, we're using a drug, but we are not primarily interested in the drug itself. There's a context of use that makes it part of our society. Instrumental use of drugs is when I'm actually using the drugs for the drug effect. And it usually comes down to pleasure-seeking, avoiding pain, and ritualistic, ceremonial, or spiritual. So let's look at those. The pleasure-seeking effect of drugs is often, if you talk to young folks and they say, why do you take drugs? The most common answer you get is because it's fun. So fun, but it's actually a little more complicated than that. When I talk to people about their drug using experience, often what they say is, when I took the drug for the first time, I became the person I always wanted to be. I had a sense of power and control over my life that I never had before. So drugs offer us that. They offer us something that is basic to our human needs. We need to have a sense of power and control in our lives. And drugs offer us that often. We also can avoid pain. We can suppress negative feelings. We can reduce our inhibitions. We can reduce anger, guilt, shame, grief, boredom, anxiety. There's many things that we may not want to be in, experiences we're having, we simply want to get out of. It can be physical or it can be emotional. And my interest in drugs is historical and cross-cultural. I am fascinated with drug use from the beginning of human history and around the culture and around the globe today. And what I observe is that we've been writing about our drug-using experiences since we first started drawing, carving on walls, and sculpting figures. So our early pre-literate experiences with our culture, when we used to write stuff down and carve things on walls, often depicted drug-using patterns. And all societies on the planet use drugs today. In fact, all societies throughout human histories have used drugs with one exception. And the exception was the Inuit. And they didn't use drugs because they couldn't use drugs. It was too cold for alcohol to ferment at that temperature, and there were no plants in their environment that they could take. But if drugs have been available in the environment that people have been at, they have used them since the beginning of recorded history. So it is not a new phenomenon. I observe that the most writings that are looking at drug-using patterns often refer to spiritual use. Ceremonial spiritual use is very, very common throughout recorded history. Habitual use of drugs is when we're taking the drugs all the time. It's a regular pattern for us now. And often we start to have problems emerging when our drug use becomes habitual. Our relationships change, our relationship with work and school changes, our health changes, our financial status changes, and our legal status changes. When I'm in the habitual use stage and I am asked by somebody, do you have a choice to continue to use drugs? Usually I will say yes. I have some level of choice around this. And I will, when I'm asked that same question in the next stage, I will say no. When I am compulsively using drugs, and I'm asked that question, do you have a choice? The answer will be no. I have no choice. I have to just keep using. When I'm compulsive, I usually have tolerance. It takes more to get the same effect. And when I stop using it, I get really, really sick, which means I'm going through withdrawals. And I will have this thing called psychological dependence. I will think about it all the time. It will be something that I obsess about a lot. I think about it, and I'm constantly planning on my next use. I will also have selected my friends at this point. I will be increasingly uncomfortable with anybody that does not use the same drug that I use in the same way. So I will have screened the people in my life to match my drug-using pattern. I also observe that we can have a binge relationship with substances. By that I mean long periods of no use and then short periods of very, very intense use. And binge use has this unique problem of being completely unpredictable. If I am a young child and I do not know if my mother is going to come home drunk and violent or sober and loving, I have a big problem as a child. So the unpredictability of binge use is a huge stressor for families specifically. I observe that as we track health over those different patterns of drug use, generally speaking, as we walk our way along that path, our health problems get worse. So people that have significant compulsive relationship with drugs usually have many health issues. If I was going to try and summarize what I have just finished saying, I would use this particular image. Now, if I look at this image, what it has is the up part of it, and the up is above the horizontal line, and the up part is when I'm happy, healthy, feeling powerful, feeling in control, feeling euphoric, things are going really well in my life. The down part of this, which is underneath the horizontal line, I'm miserable, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm insecure, I'm afraid, I'm depressed. So the negative parts of my life. And the time, as this graph marches to the right, time is unfolding. For some of us, the time can unfold in weeks. For some of us, the time can unfold in decades. So it is completely unpredictable how long this particular graph takes to unfold. When I first take drugs, they work. In fact, they work really well. I have all of the up experiences that drugs offer me. I'm happier, I'm healthier, I'm stronger, I'm more euphoric. It's a positive part of my life. And slowly as it unfolds, it into my experience creeps this kind of darkness. I become more depressed, I become more miserable. And the up part reduces until I work my way down to the right-hand part of this graph, where the best that I can get is normal. And by that I mean that the party was over a long time ago. And my experience with drugs is I just take them to manage my withdrawal patterns. And so I take them for a brief period of time, and I feel normal, and then I feel sick again. And I go through this cycle of normal, sick, normal, sick, normal, sick, normal, sick. And the experience of all the positive things that I got out of it when I initially started have completely gone away. Now, when people ask me about this graph, one of the things that people will comment is if I have been in the right-hand part of this graph, where I'm basically in the normal, sick, normal, sick, normal, sick cycle, and I stop taking it for a year and then I start using again, where do I go back to? Do I go back to the middle or I go back to the extreme left? And the answer is not that clear. It depends on what the drug is, and it depends a bit on the person as well. For something like heroin, I may never get the ecstatic beginning again. I'll go back somewhere to the left. It'll be somewhere in the middle, because I can get a drifty, dreamy, pain-relieving state again, but I won't have the same euphoria. It's interesting to looking at cannabis with this particular graph, because the initial stage of cannabis use is all about giggles, chuckles, and laughter. The middle stage of cannabis use is that there's no more laughter. The laughter's gone away. When people are smoking cannabis in the middle, it's a positive experience. They like it. People are happy and engaged and enjoying it and report a positive experience, but there's no laughter. At the extreme right of this, what it is all about anxiety. When people talk to me about their cannabis use, when it is matured, often it's about depression and anxiety. And it's interesting when if somebody's been to that place with cannabis, and 10 years have gone by and they don't smoke it, and they smoke it again, they don't go back to the beginning at all. So with cannabis, really the darkness, the negative experience with cannabis, the anxiety that people experience with it will come back immediately. So you really can't walk your way back the graph with cannabis at all, which is kind of interesting. If I was going to summarize everything I've said over the last hour, I would say that environmental factors plus vulnerable people plus access to drugs can but does not necessarily equal dependency or addiction.